How should Christian men and women go about breaking free from the bondage of sexual sin? I'll start in the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings, where everything finds its origination. And therein we find that God created us male and female. He created our bodies for pleasure and enjoyment. He created marriage for one man and one woman as His holy means by which bodily pleasures and sexual desires would find their satisfaction. So God's plan is one man, one woman, one covenant, one lifetime, together enjoying marital relations as one flesh. The Bible says at the end of Genesis 2, naked and without shame. That's God's good intention. Our first parents then sin in Genesis 3, and all kinds of things ensue, including nakedness that is accompanied with shame. They hide from one another and God. Sexual sin ensues throughout Genesis. There is incest, there is homosexuality, there is adultery, fornication, polygamy, all kinds of lust in various sinful forms and kinds dominates. And it continues throughout human history that sin in particular has a devastating effect on gender, sexuality, and issues related thereof, all the way fast forward to the fact that you and I, most of us who are in the latter evening services, are members of generations that are the result of social sexual experimentation during the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. Much of this was undergirded by scientific, I use that word loosely, study that was conducted by Alfred Kinsey called the Kinsey Report. You may have seen the film which depicted his life as an utterly sad man who was a pervert and gave his life to homosexuality and the endorsement of pedophilia, and undertook an investigation to try and legitimize various sexual sin throughout culture by saying that it was statistically common, therefore normative. Well, his study has since been dismissed because it included a disproportionate number of people who were prostitutes, inmates, people of all kinds of deviancy. It was not in any way representative of an average American life, but nonetheless, in its day, it sort of gave the impression that people were far more sexually active in far more perverted ways than was ever previously imagined, the result being that it legitimized deviant conduct and behavior. It also led to the founding of something called the Kinsey Institute, which is interesting in that he himself died around the age of 62 from a pelvic infection as a result of his own life of unrepentant perversion. Out of the Kinsey Institute came modern public sexual education for public school children. That inception was around 1964. The co-founder of the organization that continues providing sex education in public schools to this day, and the first president of that organization was Dr. Mary Calderon. She says this regarding her work, quote, "A new stage of evolution is breaking across the horizon, and the task of educators is to prepare children to, quote, step into that new world. To do this, they must pry children away from old views and values." Insert parents and churches. "Especially from biblical and other traditional forms of sexual morality, for religious laws or rules about sex were made on the basis of ignorance." She said, we're going to prepare children to be more sexual. To do that, we must separate them from church and family, and we must introduce sex education into the public school system. That was a radical, revolutionary change that includes those of us who were born after the 1960s or during the 1960s and 70s. And not surprisingly, who was the first financial donor for public sex education in America in the public school system? None other than Playboy's own Hugh Hefner, to indoctrinate children to become perverted so that they would grow up and purchase his products. You and I are products of an experiment that is tragic. The result is that you and I, most of us who are of a certain age or younger, born into a world where it seems like sexual sin and perversion of all sort and kind is normative because it's all that we have known. But it is not normative, it is in fact deviant. This includes the fact that I will build my presuppositions on the point today that I believe there are really two popular religions in America and across the globe. There are secondary religions like Confucianism and Buddhism and Islam and and such, Shintoism and Mormonism and such. But truly, the two most popular religions are Christianity and sex. That sex is not understood as a religion, but it is a religion. It's a worldview, an ideology, it's a commitment. That's why people will say, I am gay, I am straight, I am bi, we are swingers, or I'm a Christian. It's an identity that encompasses all of your life. You identify yourself by your sexuality, your sexual proclivities and preferences and lifestyle. That's why people devote themselves to groups, causes. They have parades, they have pride days, they have websites and gatherings and fundraising and devotion to promulgate a certain sexual ethic, in effect to have evangelistic crusades to convert people to sexual practices as very much evangelistic as any religion. The question is, well, why is sex such a popular religion with religious devotion and adherence? Well, it's because God made our bodies to enjoy sexual pleasure, and God's intention was that it would bind a man and a woman together in marriage, but sadly, it has been used for sinful purposes. Stephen Arterburn, who is a Christian counselor that writes extensively on the issue of sexual sin and sexual addiction, says this: sexual pleasure is one of the most intense human experiences. Physically speaking, when a man or a woman reaches sexual excitement, nerve endings release a chemical into the brain called opioid. Opioid means opium-like and is a good description of the power of the chemical. Now listen to this. Apart from a heroin-induced experience, nothing is more pleasurable than sex. The only thing that is equal chemically, physiologically, to sexual intercourse is heroin. This is a wonderful thing in a committed marriage relationship because it helps to bond two people together and to bring joy to living together and building a relationship. There can be a downside to the pleasure of sex, however. If sexual experiences happen outside of marriage and are constantly repeated, a sex act can move from being a simple pleasure to an addiction. Instead of being bonded with a person, you become bonded to the act itself. If the sexual experiences are pornography, your flesh or your body will instantly recall the images you viewed for relusting purposes. We'll call that the harem of the mind. These images are stamped into your brain with the aid of hormones released during sexual arousal. God intends sex to exist within marriage. God hardwired our physical, anatomical, male and female bodies to enjoy pleasure and to cause us to desire one another within marriage. That means that lust, by definition, is morally neutral. Lust is a strong, passionate desire, a yearning for pleasure. And that can be a very good thing within marriage. If your lust is for your spouse, you desire your spouse, you long for your spouse, you enjoy your spouse, you delight in your spouse, you yearn for your spouse, well, that's a perfectly holy and good thing. But lust in its negative sense is lusting for a person or a thing or an experience outside of God's boundaries of marriage. Jesus says that lust in its sinful form is ultimately rooted in the deception of the heart, the center of who we are. Jesus says in Matthew 5 that it is a sin to commit adultery, but in addition to that, to lust in your heart is to commit adultery in your heart. And so lust is the problem, sinful lust, which leads to sinful activity. All sex outside of heterosexual marriage is by God's own decree from Genesis to Revelation, unholy and forbidden. All of that is lust in a depraved way, working itself towards sin rather than marriage. And some of you are here and you're immediately thinking, well, I do something not on that list. Does that mean I'm okay? No, you're a pervert and you are condemned as well. Okay? And in the New Testament, God anticipated perverts. And so when speaking of sexual immorality, which is the English translation, the Bible uses the Greek word porneia, which is a junk drawer term that means any and all kind of sexual sin. God knew that if he made a big list and put all the sexual sins on it, someone eventually, somewhere, would invent something else, thinking they were the exception clause, and you're not. God has a junk drawer that just says sexual immorality. Whatever it is you are doing, it falls into that category. Now,